By April 1945, the war was already dying, but it was not finished killing. As Nazi Germany collapsed, a final order moved quietly through broken command lines. It was not meant to win the war, only to erase evidence and lives. When Canadian troops intercepted it, they realized time itself was the enemy. What they stopped would never appear in victory parades, yet it may have saved tens of thousands. Northern Germany, April 1945. The front was no longer a clear line on a map but a series of fractures, pockets of resistance surrounded by retreat, panic, and surrender. Canadian units advancing eastward moved through towns that no longer defended themselves. White flags hung from windows. Weapons lay abandoned in ditches. German soldiers, exhausted and hollow-eyed, stepped out from cellars holding scraps of paper instead of rifles. To Allied commanders, the situation seemed almost resolved. Radio traffic spoke less of battles and more of logistics, prisoners to be processed, bridges to be secured, refugees to be fed. Yet beneath this surface of collapse, fragments of the Nazi command structure were still functioning. Orders were still being written. Messages were still being sent. Canadian reconnaissance units began encountering something unusual. Not resistance, but urgency. Couriers traveling without unit markings. Trucks moving at night with sealed cargo and no manifests. Officers who refused surrender until documents were destroyed. In several captured headquarters, Canadian intelligence officers found hurriedly burned files and smashed radios, as if someone had tried, too late, to erase a trail. Then came the first intact transmission. Intercepted by signals units and confirmed by documents seized during a sudden surrender, it referred to a directive issued directly from Berlin. It was not a battlefield order. It did not mention Allied forces at all. Instead, it spoke in coded language about final security measures, cleansing operations, and actions to be carried out independently if communication was lost. What unsettled Canadian officers was the timing. The Reich was already disintegrating. Berlin was nearly encircled. Yet this order was dated only days earlier. As more fragments were pieced together, a pattern emerged. The directive was meant for units operating behind the lines, SS remnants, security battalions, and local command authorities. It instructed them to act even in total isolation. Even after surrender elsewhere. Even if Germany no longer existed. Canadian commanders began to understand that this was not about fighting the Allies. It was about finishing something else before the war ended. What exactly that something was remained unclear in those first hours. But the language, the secrecy, and the desperation pointed to a single terrifying conclusion: this order was designed to erase people, not defend territory. And if it was not stopped quickly, the war's final night could become one of its darkest. The next days unfolded like a grim scavenger hunt. Canadian units, moving cautiously through the shattered towns of northern Germany, began uncovering the true scope of the order. It was called Endlosung der letzten Phase, the final phase solution, a name that chilled even the most battle-hardened soldiers. Intelligence officers pieced together that it was meant to be executed in late April, targeting concentration camp prisoners, political dissidents, and anyone deemed a threat to the Reich's purity in the final hours. The order had a single goal: mass extermination, carried out in secrecy before the Allies could take control. In a small town near Lübeck, a patrol discovered a warehouse with crates labeled in cryptic codes, guarded by a skeleton crew of SS men who surrendered without resistance. Inside were stockpiles of chemicals, ammunition, and meticulously prepared lists of names and locations. It became immediately clear that the order was not just theoretical, the logistics were already in place. Some Canadian soldiers could not hide their horror. For weeks, these items had been prepared to annihilate thousands in one night. Entire towns, entire populations, might have vanished if no one had intervened. Canadian commanders quickly convened an emergency briefing. Maps were spread across tables, marking the sites listed in the order. Officers spoke in low, urgent tones. The reality was terrifying. The German command, despite the imminent fall of the Reich, had orchestrated a plan to commit genocide even in defeat. The soldiers understood that preventing it would require a combination of speed, strategy, and discretion. Alerting higher Allied command risked bureaucratic delays, and every hour counted. The Canadians were faced with a moral and military imperative: act now, or witness one of the war's final atrocities unfold. Field intelligence units coordinated with local partisans and sympathetic German civilians. They began intercepting couriers, capturing remaining SS officers, and destroying weapons and chemicals before they could be deployed. Every movement was calculated to avoid alerting the remaining German units that their final solution was being dismantled. Meanwhile, reconnaissance patrols continued to follow the trail of the order, discovering hidden camps and warehouses. Each find added pieces to a chilling puzzle. Hundreds of prisoners had already been moved, some in secret trains, others hidden in rural estates, awaiting a fate from which no one would return if the Canadians failed. Despite the danger, the Canadian troops showed an unflinching determination. They understood that this mission had no glory, no medals waiting at the end. It was a race against both time and a crumbling enemy determined to see its plan through. Messages were relayed swiftly, and operations executed with precision, guards detained, stockpiles neutralized, and prisoners liberated wherever possible. By the end of several tense days, large sections of the planned operation had already been thwarted. The soldiers could see it in the vacant, haunted eyes of liberated prisoners and in the skeletal remains of hastily abandoned execution sites. The potential scale of the disaster was almost unimaginable. They had prevented not just a tactical maneuver but an entire wave of calculated human destruction. And yet, even as relief began to settle, a shadow of doubt lingered. Could every fragment of the plan be intercepted? Or was some part of the order still active, somewhere deeper in the fractured German hinterland? The Canadians were about to find out. The war's final hours held more secrets, and each discovery only deepened the urgency. By mid-April, Canadian forces had gained a clearer picture of the final phase solution, but clarity came with a terrible weight. The documents and warehouses told part of the story, but the true horror lay in what had not yet been discovered. Entire regions had been designated as execution sites, and some units were still unaccounted for. The orders were explicit: carry out mass killings even if Berlin fell, even if communications failed, even if Germany ceased to exist as a nation. The instructions were mechanical, cold, and absolute. There was no room for negotiation, no latitude for conscience, only the relentless drive to complete the Reich's last act of terror. The Canadian commanders faced a dilemma that went beyond strategy. They had intercepted the order, understood its implications, and now controlled the resources to act, but the clock was ticking. Should they report everything immediately to higher Allied command, risking delays as information worked its way through bureaucratic channels? Or should they act independently, using the intelligence at hand to dismantle the operation before it could be executed? Every minute of hesitation could cost thousands of lives. Morally, there was no question, action was mandatory. But militarily, acting without explicit authorization carried enormous risks. They were not merely fighting an enemy, they were stopping a plan designed to outlast the war itself. A series of rapid decisions followed. Mobile units were dispatched to intercept convoys of prisoners and seize control of critical locations. Officers coordinated with local German civilians who had resisted the Nazis, using their knowledge of hidden facilities and secret routes to gain the upper hand. Explosives were used not to destroy towns but to neutralize weapons caches and chemical stockpiles. Orders were executed with precision and speed. Canadian troops moved through the night, sometimes just hours ahead of death itself. It was a delicate balance: act decisively, but avoid unnecessary chaos that could alert remaining SS units. Lives depended on their judgment. At one captured facility, a Canadian officer uncovered a ledger containing hundreds of names. Prisoners were scheduled for transport to a nearby camp that had been rigged for mass killing. The officer ordered immediate intervention. Teams worked through the night to free the prisoners, who were too weak to walk and too terrified to comprehend what had just been prevented. Some soldiers held back tears as they guided men, women, and children to safety, realizing that these lives would have vanished if not for a single decision to act without waiting for orders. By the end of the operation, several units of the SS had been detained, key facilities secured, and large numbers of prisoners liberated. The Canadians had effectively neutralized the final phase solution in the region under their control. But the victory was quiet, almost invisible. Unlike battles won on the front lines, this success would remain largely unacknowledged. Yet among the soldiers, there was a profound sense of purpose. They had done what needed to be done, preventing one of the war's final catastrophes, and in doing so had ensured that the war would end without a last night of mass slaughter. Even so, questions lingered. Could the remaining fragments of the order be active elsewhere? Was the Reich hiding more horrors in its death throes? For now, the Canadians had bought time, perhaps the most valuable currency of all in the final days of a world at war. By late April 1945, the crumbling towns and bombed-out roads of northern Germany bore silent witness to the collapse of the Reich. Canadian units moved cautiously through the ruins, mindful that the war's final horrors could still be lurking. The final phase solution had been partially intercepted, and its immediate threat neutralized, but the weight of what had been prevented settled heavily on the soldiers' minds. They had stopped a plan that could have erased tens of thousands of lives in a single night. Yet, unlike victories celebrated with parades and medals, this triumph was invisible, almost unspoken, known only to those who had acted. Reports were quietly filed, maps annotated, and surviving prisoners transported to liberated areas. Canadian intelligence officers documented the intercepted orders, the warehouses, and the captured SS personnel. Every detail mattered. These records would serve as evidence of the Nazis' last desperate measures. But the war itself was closing rapidly. Berlin fell, Hitler was dead, and the world would soon turn its attention to the scale of destruction already wrought. Few outside the Canadian units would ever know that in northern Germany, one more tragedy had been averted. For the soldiers on the ground, the experience left an indelible mark. They had seen the machinery of genocide up close, not just the ideology, but the logistics, the planning, the cold efficiency. The crates of chemicals, the prepared lists, and the abandoned execution sites all told the same story. Even in defeat, the Reich intended to carry out unspeakable acts. Acting decisively required courage, judgment, and a sense of moral clarity that few conflicts demand. The Canadians had displayed all three. Their actions were swift and precise, a stark contrast to the chaos around them. They had turned the enemy's plan back on itself, neutralizing death with calculated intervention. In the following weeks, liberated prisoners began to rebuild their lives, though the psychological scars remained. The Canadian units continued their advance, documenting atrocities, detaining remaining Nazi officials, and securing regions for the incoming Allied administrations. Each discovery reinforced a sobering truth: the final phase solution was not merely a plan, it was a glimpse into how far desperation and ideology could drive a regime on the brink of collapse. When historians would later examine the closing days of the war, few would note the quiet heroism in northern Germany. the story would remain largely untold, hidden in filed reports and personal diaries. Yet for the soldiers who had intercepted the orders, risked their lives, and acted without hesitation, the impact was undeniable. They had stopped one of the last, and potentially deadliest, plans of the Nazi regime. In doing so, they not only saved thousands of lives but preserved the fragile possibility that humanity could endure even in the war's final hours. The war ended. Cities lay in ruins, empires crumbled, and millions mourned. But in a northern German town, a small victory had quietly prevented a final night of horror. And for those who had been there, it was enough to know that even as the world burned, courage and decisive action had made a difference.